Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth. Fred DeLorey, Bruce Anderson, coming right up. Okay, gentlemen, a little smoke, mirrors, and the truth to start, and we'll actually use that phrase in this because I'll be looking to see how each of you, whether you fall under smoke or mirrors or truth, on the two subjects for today. And the first one is the budget. Now, any new government is, people are looking forward to what that budget's going to tell them, whether they're individuals or businesses, what have you. There's been there's been question marks around the timing of the budget. First of all, it seemed like it was possible it might even not be this year. Then it was going to be this spring or not this spring. Now it's decided with the Prime Minister weighing in from Rome the other day that it will definitely be this year and it'll be this fall. Now, is any of this anything special? Is this much ado about nothing? Or is this a new government kind of scrambling a bit to sort this situation out? And we'll let Fred start with this one this week.
That's a great way to go. Let Fred start with this.
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to it.
Well, look, I think when you run a campaign where we just had an election and your entire narrative boils down to you're the man with the plan, you're the person who can lead us through all of these issues. In fact, Prime Minister Carney used it as an attack point against Poilievre when he said a plan beats no plan. So then to come out of the campaign and go, whoops, well, actually, we don't have a plan. Let's wait a while and figure this out. I think that strikes a bit at his narrative and at the core of who he is and why people elected him. I think a lot of people elected Mark Carney because who they think he is, based on his resume, being the central banker and chair of Brookfield. I don't think they actually really know who he is, and he's going to have to show that he can do the things he said he's going to do. And it is problematic. It does strike at the core of his narrative when he comes out with this mess. Now, it can be course corrected. It doesn't mean that this is anything we'll be talking about in a few weeks. They have announced they're going to do it in October. It's something that they can certainly communicate much better on why they got to this situation. There could be a very good reason why October is the time to do this, but they haven't explained that. And again, the initial response was, we're not going to do a budget this year. That's just mind-boggling that they would go down that route. But I understand they have a $5-6 billion tax cut they're bringing in soon, which is good. There's obviously the tariff issue they have to deal with Trump and understanding how that affects the budget, other programs and what they're going to cost. There's the G7 meetings in June in Canada that maybe there'll be some impact there on our budget. So maybe those are all reasons they could be saying why there's no budget this spring. But why am I saying that and not them?
Well, Bruce was nodding all the way through that, so he obviously totally agrees with everything he just said.
I just love hearing Freddie talk about this kind of thing, because nobody's better at trying to make something out of very, very little. I mean, it is a craft in the business of politics, and I appreciate it and respect the game when somebody shows me how to do it. So good for you, Freddie. But look, I think it was Brian Mulroney took 248 days between the time he was sworn in and the time he tabled his first budget. And Stephen Harper, at least ChatGPT reminds me that it was 85 days. Now, I think both of those people had a plan when they were elected. I think both of those people did the right thing when they were elected. Conservative leaders, by the way. I could mention the liberal ones, but it's the same pattern. It's not, you don't table it right away. You get into office and you look at the situation you've got. You align the fiscal picture that you've got with the goals that you set out in the campaign. And then you develop, okay, how are we going to do this? Where are we going to trim spending? Where are we going to increase spending? And I think what's a little bit unique in this situation well, what is unique in this situation, every situation has its own idiosyncrasies, I think, but what's a little bit different here is that we have a giant issue on the table that everybody can see in plain sight. It is not concealed at all, which is our relationship with the United States and the question of tariffs. What will the impact be of tariffs if they are imposed on us in the way in which they have been threatened? And what will government need to do in order to cushion the impact of those on Canadian businesses and Canadian workers? If we find a way through that conversation where we don't need to plan for those kind of contingencies, then obviously you're going to have rather a different scenario from a fiscal standpoint. It's going to change all of the dynamics. So for everybody that says, I need to see a budget now, even before the next meeting of the prime minister and the president happen, even before we see the evolution of the trade conversations between the United States and China, and the further conversations that Canada is going to have with the United States, you know what? It feels a little bit to me like it's going to be a long 3 or 4 years if we're going to evaluate the performance of government in 10-minute increments. And that isn't really the way that voters look at this. Voters are kind of like, okay, we had an election. You gave us a couple of options. We picked this one. Now we're going back to our lives. You get on with doing the work. And we'll let you know how we feel about it as we go, but probably not in 10-minute increments. That feels more like what Twitter is built for, or X, or whatever it's called now, rather than regular people living regular lives.
You buying that, Fred?
Well, look, I think expectations
are.
I think expectations are very high for Carney, and 10-minute increments is an interesting way to look at it, but things can set in quickly too and turn on you and be hard to wrestle back if you lose people. I understand, like, the points you made were similar to what I made about why it makes sense, maybe why they don't have a budget now. But why aren't they saying that? Why are you and I saying it? I think it goes back to part of the failure of communications. The Liberals, I think, are some of the best communicators, but it seems to be only 2 to 3 weeks every 4 years that they can tie that message together, and then they just go into this weird place where they can't tell the story,
where they do the work, where maybe that's it, right? Maybe it's just like,
I think the last 10 years, I'm not sure I'd say Trudeau's government did the work. At least
this is so different from that, but I take your point.
But communications wise, it isn't, right? Like the Trudeau Liberals didn't tell a story well. Now Carney Liberals have a story to tell, and if there's a reason to delay this, they should tell it. They should lay it out like you just laid it out, and they have not been doing that. It's been this weird uncertainty that's coming out of them.
You know what? I hear you on that, but I kind of also feel like there's a frothiness, and sometimes I feel like to all of that questioning, and it's making me feel like we are really living in such a changed world. Where I watched that long form interview with the Prime Minister the other day, and I was struck at the questions about how different is this cabinet. Prove to us that it's really different, that kind of thing. And I understand, I respect Vashi for doing her job and the way she does her job, and I understand why she asked that question. But I just look at it as a pollster a little bit, and I sort of say, well, how likely is it that the average voter, that's the thing that they really want to know more about, as opposed to,
right,
what is it that you want to build? What is it that's on the table in terms of our relationship with the UK and France and other European countries? Stuff that's a little bit more about the substance in the Prime Minister's mind and what the agenda is. And I feel like the reason for those kinds of questions, why isn't the budget sooner? How many of your ministers are Trudeau ministers? Is that there's just a little bit too much of a, let's keep the election going. Let's use a kind of a gotcha frame for all of the interactions with the government. Fair enough. People, free to do that. I just don't think voters are going along for that ride, to your point about, opinions will be quick to set in and they'll be hard to change.
Let me just ask one last question on this, because some people are making the argument that Carney definitely has a plan and he knows what his plan is. But maybe he hasn't shared it with some of his key ministers, like his finance minister. Is that an unfair observation? because that's kind of what it looked like in this seemingly fumbling around on the budget date, because it didn't seem the prime minister had any doubt in his mind when it was. Any thoughts on that?
Well, look, I mean, I'm going to be a broken record here on this whole notion of the gaff watch, the fumble watch. I mean, if anybody put a camera on any of our lives and said, look, just 5 minutes ago, this is what you did, and I didn't see that coming, and you better explain that to me. That's not going to be a very interesting show in terms of my life, but it's also not that relevant, I don't think, to how government needs to work. And of course, this government has only been in place for, you can count them in hours, and there's a lot that's been going on. On the whole idea of these, supposedly horrible gaffes, the housing minister said something that anybody looking carefully at it, or even just reasonably at it, would say, well, what exactly was wrong with what he said? Yeah, he's been vilified on social media. I don't think it matters. I don't think voters will pay attention to it. But what he said was, our plan is to build a lot of affordable housing at scale so that people who are trying to get that first house in the housing market have a chance to do it. But at the same time, obviously, we don't want to crush the equity that people have built up in the homes that they already own. What politician would ever try to get elected on the idea of, let's crush the value of the homes that you own, Peter, in order for people to be able to buy those homes? It doesn't even make any sense. So, but that, spent 2 or 3 days being the subject of, people being kind of aghast at the fumbles and the gaffes and everything else. And I'm not here for it. I just don't see it that way. I don't think voters do either.
Fred, shall I move on, or do you want to say something? Because it's an interesting headline. I want to see how consistent Bruce is when I read the next headline, but you go ahead.
Well, just on the cabinet ministers and all of the different things that they said last week, I think one of the issues is, this is a new government. The government was sworn in last week, so I understand that maybe Gaff Watch shouldn't be as we shouldn't be as focused on that. But man, there was a lot of gaffes, and it was them walking into cabinet, just giving their opinions before they even sit around the table as a team and talk about, okay, this is their first cabinet meeting, and the prime minister should be laying out the direction, and they should all be having that cabinet confidential conversation about what the priorities are and how they're going to move things. Instead, it was just these ministers walking in, giving their opinions on different things, which I thought was absurd. And it reminds me back to the Harper era, which I had worked for the entire time he was prime minister. My favorite caucus in cabinet ins and outs, and that's when cabinet ministers are going in and out and reporters are scrubbing them. My favorite was during the Harper era because they didn't happen. We didn't do ins and outs. It's something that makes no sense. If you don't have a story to tell, don't tell it.
Okay. Bruce, headline in the Hill Times today. Is this much ado about nothing? To limit critics, let me read it.
What's the headline?
Here it is. To limit critics' time to organize against Poilievre, some senior conservatives explore moving the convention to this fall. What do you make of that?
I don't know anything about it, but it sounds kind of normal in terms of how parties deal with situations like the one that the conservatives find themselves in, where they've got a leader who's got a lot of strength, and so he can kind of organize and apply pressure on the rules or the procedures in order to protect his position. But I'm anxious to hear what Fred can do to explain this situation, because it could be jiggery-pokery. It could be something that we really need to be very worried about in terms of the future of our democracy. But it doesn't sound like that, if I'm being honest right off the top.
Jiggery-pokery?
The convention is supposed to be this fall. It's supposed to be every 2 years, but because it was an election year, I guess the National Council pushed it to 2026 instead. So that on those grounds, it makes sense to move it up. But of course, for the leader and his perspective, there is an automatic leadership review after you lose an election. and delegates will come and they will cast a ballot on whether he should stay or go. I see no scenario that he loses that. I think he'll get a massive, massive, massive win. The party is very much still behind him, but there is a risk if they do it next winter. Who knows what the world looks like? Events happen. Maybe Carney actually does put a budget in that people like, and things are taken off, and maybe affordability is dealt with. Maybe the tariff threat's gone, and maybe crime is down. All of these issues that galvanize support behind the Conservatives, maybe those disappear, and Poilievre is looked at as not someone who can win. So that's a risk to him, as it would for any leader in that situation. So politically, it makes sense. Do it as soon as you can. If you're popular now, let's have this vote now internally and get it over with. It also puts it in the back rearview mirror where he can really start focusing on the next election and not so worried about the last one.
It does, and can we ask Fred a follow-up on this? Because it does feel to me that well, I don't think he's doing it kind of overtly so that everybody can see it. It feels to me like Mr. Poilievre is reaching out within his party. He's trying to, without saying I screwed up, saying, there's an element of outreach that's important. That's not just performative. That is a requirement rather than I'm the guy. I don't need any help. I'm going to do it my way. Do you sense that change is going on?
I do think that's happening. Now, whether he'll, I know he's certainly making calls, but is he taking the advice? That remains to be seen. But I think that's what he should be doing. He should be going dark right now, essentially, in terms of the public being out there. He doesn't need to be out there. He needs to be reviewing what happened and figure out the path forward. And he seems to be doing that. As I mentioned before on the previous show, he's never lost before. This is the first time he's ever lost elected office at any level. So it is a learning experience when that happens, and it's usually where you learn the most from. You look at, Brian Mulroney lost his leadership against Joe Clark. Stephen Harper lost his first election against Paul Martin. Both those individuals really changed their approach and changed how they did things after those losses, and figured out the path to victory, and they went on to big wins. And Poilievre has to do the same. He has to figure out how he can get over that hurdle where, yes, he got 8 million votes, but so did the Liberals. And we can't win in that scenario as Conservatives. We need to figure out how we can, if it's a two-party race, how we can make sure we're not offending voters and scaring them away.
Well, let me just leave it with this comment and get your reaction to it. It just seems to me when I read a headline like this and a story like this, all it does to me is indicate that there are those who are on Poilievre's side who believe the threat to Poilievre is more serious than perhaps we're giving it credit for.
Yeah, it's one of those things. I remember like Andrew Scheer and Aaron O'Toole were in similar positions. They were in pretty strong positions. People forget because they both ended up losing their leadership spots. But they were in strong positions for those first few months, and it changed. The Freedom Convoy, the trucker convoy in Ottawa was something that really shifted ground on O'Toole. Then there was some issues with the party. So events happen, things happen, sometimes out of your control, sometimes in your control. And it's a risk. As long as until that vote is had, he is vulnerable. At the same time, I would say I've seen no one waiting in the wings organizing against him, which was different than Scheer and O'Toole. There were people organizing then.
Bruce, you have any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, look, I think it makes sense that you would be, in the history of the Conservative Party in its different iterations, it would make sense to recognize that there is always a risk of the factions. And Fred has done a good job of describing the different factions within the Conservative movement. I think Pierre Poilievre has done a good job of uniting those factions. But a lot of that, of the effectiveness that he had was showing everybody the 25-point lead that he had. And so this is different, and it would be prudent for him to tend to these factions and to think through the question of, how do I remotivate people if I need to head into another election? How can I strengthen their confidence in me? Is it really only about how well I criticize Mark Carney and what the Liberals are going to do? Or is there an aspect of my behavior, of my temperament, my comportment, my communications that I should be changing? I think those are all good questions for him to be dwelling on. But I think I'm where Fred is on the likelihood of there being a real problem for him in the foreseeable future. I think he's got time and he's got the confidence of the vast majority of his party to kind of work on those things and to see how the Liberals do. But that reckoning will come down the road, probably not in the next 12 months, I guess is where I'd be.
If I could just say one more thing on this, it just brought me back something you said, Bruce, to 2004 when we lost, when Harper lost to Paul Martin. His big question wasn't whether he can stay on or if he has support in the party. It's whether he can ever win. And that's the real question I think Poilievre has to try to come to ground to. Can he win? Yes, he can win the leadership group, whatever it is. But Harper's focus was, is it possible? Because it is hard as a conservative to win. We're well aware of that. The math and the way the country is built is it favors the Liberal Party in almost every election.
Oh my God, you sound like a Leaf fan now. It's like, oh, it's so hard to win. We have all the money. All the money. We have all the fans. We get all the attention. But
things have to go really well. Well, look, and we do win a little bit more than the Leafs, but not a lot.
Too soon, you guys. Too soon.
Too soon? Yeah.
Yeah, not fair.
No, but Fred is right. It's hard to... I was looking at the trend lines of the Conservative vote, which actually have been fairly stable over the years. The Liberal ones tends to fluctuate more. The Liberal Party being a party that tries to find that center and the largest number of voters. Its mistake is that every once in a while, its recurring mistake is every once in a while, it kind of pushes a little further left than people want. And then sometimes it pushes a little bit more towards the center than the left wants. And it has this kind of more jagged profile in terms of support. Conservative support tends to be a little bit more stable, but it has a ceiling. And the ceiling is the difference between what the mission conservatives want and what mainstream Canadians really want to see in government. And I think that's a perpetual problem, but I think we're heading into another phase of it because I think the biggest question for every politician in a way is Canadians aren't sure that government is worth it anymore. And I know that's a kind of a blanket statement and it's not everybody, but it's about 3 out of 4 who say it costs me more than it benefits me. That's a category problem for politicians. It's not just a brand problem. It might work a little bit better for conservatives if they're saying, well, we just want to reduce the scale and the activities of government. More challenging for the Liberals because their challenge then is not just to say, here's a better version of government, but to prove that government can actually solve economic problems, can deliver social benefits, and can be a net positive in your life. That's a different phase that we're in. We see it in the United States playing out big time, but it is here in Canada now too.
That's a fascinating observation and one worthy of a future discussion, which I'm sure we'll have. All right. Thank you both, Bruce Anderson, Fred DeLorey. Smoke mirrors the truth.
Gents, good to see you.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks, guys.